Summer's mother, Dina Thompson, joins us now from her home in Orange Park. Dina, please accept our condolences and know that we all share in your heartbreak this morning.
On a summer night in 1994, a telephone rang inside a small house in Yapton, West Sussex. The caller was Rosemary Webb. It was her son Julian's 31st birthday, and she wanted to speak to him. Nothing about that should have been unusual. Birthdays are the sort of dates families remember automatically. You make the call. You hear the voice. You ask how the day has been. But Rosemary did not get the conversation she expected. Julian's wife, Dina, answered instead. Julian, she said, was too ill to come to the phone. Rosemary was concerned enough to tell her to get medical help. By the time the night was over, Julian Webb would be dead. His death would not be immediately treated as murder. There would be no dramatic arrest outside the house, no confession, no obvious crime scene pointing detectives toward a killer. For years, the case would sit in an uncomfortable place between suspicion and proof. And the woman beside Julian during his final hours would move on with her life. That is what makes this story so disturbing. It is not simply about a poisoned meal. It is about how one death became almost invisible inside a much larger pattern of lies. It is about marriages that were not what they appeared to be, money that disappeared, identities that overlapped, stories so extravagant that people sometimes struggled to separate fact from fantasy, and a trail of men who would later describe remarkably similar experiences. Long before a jury called Dina Thompson a murderer, she had already learned something important about deception. The biggest lie does not always work because it sounds believable. Sometimes it works because it is surrounded by dozens of smaller lies, each one distracting from the last. Before we go further, subscribe if you enjoy true crime stories told through the evidence and timeline. We cover cases where the truth is darker than it first appears. Now, back to Dina Thompson. Julian Webb was not the first man in Dina's life. Years earlier, when she was still known as Dina Holmes, she met Lee Wyatt. They married in 1984. On the surface, they were building an ordinary married life, but Lee would later tell a very different story about what happened behind closed doors. According to accounts later heard in court and reported after Dina's conviction, she convinced him that a toy business and a potential deal could bring them extraordinary wealth. The story grew. Documents and letters appeared to support it. Then came another twist. Lee was led to believe that dangerous people were interested in the supposed fortune and that his safety was at risk. To an outsider, the claim sounded bizarre. To someone living inside the story day after day, they could become a world of their own. Lee eventually spent long periods away, moving from place to place, believing he was protecting himself and his family. Dina remained in Sussex, and while Lee still believed himself to be her husband, another man entered her life. His name was Julian Webb. Julian worked in advertising sales and was in his late 20s when he met Dina. Their relationship moved quickly. After only a short courtship, the two went through a marriage ceremony in 1991. There was a problem Julian did not fully understand at the time. Dina was still legally married to Lee Wyatt. That made her marriage to Julian bigamous. But Julian was not entering the relationship believing he was part of a triangle. As far as he was concerned, he had found the woman he wanted to build a life with. People close to Julian were uneasy. His mother, Rosemary, later recalled warning him about marrying a woman he had known for such a short time. But families cannot make those decisions for adults. Julian went ahead. The couple lived in Yapton, near Arundel, and from the outside there was little reason for neighbors to imagine that the marriage sat on top of another marriage, financial deception, and a growing threat that the separate parts of Dina's life might collide. Money was already becoming a central theme. Dina worked at the Woolwich Building Society in Arundel. She would later be convicted over money taken from the institution. Reports from the period describe tens of thousands of pounds being diverted through dishonest transactions. Prosecutors would also present her as a woman who repeatedly used stories, forged paperwork, and emotional pressure to control money belonging to other people. But in the early 1990s, Julian did not have the benefit of seeing that pattern laid out in a courtroom. He saw only the life immediately in front of him. Then the walls began to close in. Lee Wyatt had not vanished from Dina's life permanently. By 1994, he was asking questions and reappearing in a way that threatened the arrangement. According to the prosecution years later, one of Dina's fears was simple and potentially catastrophic for her. Lee and Julian might meet. If they did, each man could discover that the other existed. Julian would learn that his marriage was not legally what he believed it to be. Lee would learn that his wife had built another life while he was still tied to her, and questions about money and documents could follow. There was another problem. Dina's conduct at the building society was also capable of exposing her. The prosecution later argued that Julian knew too little about what was really happening, while Dina had reason to fear that the different strands of her deception were about to become impossible to keep apart. Then came Julian's birthday in June 1994. He was turning 31. At some point that day, he ate one of his favorite meals, a very hot curry. Julian liked spicy food. That detail would seem almost meaningless at first. Years later, it would become one of the most important details in the entire case. During the evening, Julian became extremely unwell. When Rosemary called, Dina told her he could not come to the telephone. Rosemary urged her to seek medical help. The exact private moments inside that house can never be reconstructed perfectly. Julian could not later describe what he had eaten, what he had been given to drink, what he felt happening to his body, or what was said to him as his condition worsened. What investigators eventually established was that drugs were in his system at dangerous levels. Antidepressant medication and aspirin were central to the toxicology. At the time, however, there was still a question hanging over everything. Had Julian taken the drugs himself? Dina said he had. That explanation mattered because suicide could turn a suspicious death into a private tragedy. Yet the people who knew Julian struggled with it. The coroner did not simply accept a neat conclusion that he had deliberately ended his own life. The inquest returned an open verdict. It was an unusual kind of ending. Officially, the door had not closed on the possibility of something else, but there was not enough evidence then to call his death murder. For Rosemary Webb, the loss was already unbearable. She had called her son on his birthday and had not been allowed to speak to him. Now she was being told that he had died from an overdose. Dina reportedly wanted Julian cremated. Rosemary refused. Julian was buried in a family plot at Hayling Island in Hampshire. That decision would matter years later in a way no one could have fully understood at the funeral. Almost immediately after Julian's death, money again entered the picture. Contemporary and later reports describe Dina making inquiries about a death benefit or pension payment connected to Julian's employment. The amount is reported in different accounts as roughly £35,000 to £36,000, but Dina faced a legal obstacle. She was not simply Julian's unquestioned widow. Her earlier marriage to Lee Wyatt had never been legally ended when she married Julian. Rosemary was able to challenge Dina's position as next of kin. It was one more strange feature in a death already filled with them. A young man dies on his birthday. His wife says overdose. The coroner will not call it suicide. His mother had been concerned about the marriage. His supposed widow is still married to another man, and almost immediately there are questions about money. Still, suspicion is not evidence. Police cannot build a murder conviction from unease. In 1994, forensic science could tell investigators that drugs were present, but it could not tell them with certainty how Julian had swallowed them or who had put them there. Without proof of administration, without a reliable witness, and without a confession, the case could go no further. Dina's life did. In 1995, she was imprisoned for theft or deception connected to her work at the Building Society. The exact figures reported over the years vary, but the case established something important. Financial dishonesty was no longer just an accusation made by an angry partner. It was a criminal conviction. Her marriage to Lee Wyatt eventually ended in divorce. Julian was dead. And once again, Dina was free to begin another relationship with a man who did not yet know how much history came with her. That man was Richard Thompson. Richard was a British telecom manager who met Dina through a Lonely Hearts advertisement. By then, she had a way of presenting herself that could be intensely persuasive. She could appear vulnerable, exciting, romantic, and completely committed. People who later spoke about her described not a woman who obviously looked dangerous, but someone capable of drawing others into her version of reality. That distinction is important. Predators rarely announce themselves as predators. Richard and Dina married. They made plans for the future, including time in Florida. Richard took steps toward a different life after retirement. There was every reason for him to think he was moving toward something new. Instead, behind the relationship, his finances were being damaged. Dina was stealing from him. According to the later criminal case, she also defrauded 2 other men. Loans, credit, forged signatures, and missing money became part of the story. Richard did not immediately understand the scale of it, but by the beginning of 2000, Dina had a serious problem. Her lies were at risk of discovery again. What happened next would eventually bring detectives back to Julian Webb. On New Year's Day 2000, Richard was at home with Dina. He later described what began as a sexual game. He was tied and vulnerable. Then the mood changed. Richard said Dina struck him with a baseball bat and attacked him with a knife. He suffered injuries but managed to resist and survive. The scene sounds, at first, like the moment the entire case should have become obvious. But criminal trials are not built on what later appears obvious. Dina gave a different account. She said Richard had become violent after discovering that she had taken his money and that she had acted in self-defense. At Lou's Crown Court, the jury acquitted her of attempted murder. That acquittal has to remain part of the story. Richard believed she tried to kill him. Prosecutors accused her of trying to kill him, but the jury was not convinced beyond reasonable doubt, and Dina was legally cleared of that charge. She was not cleared of the fraud. She admitted a series of deception offenses involving Richard and 2 former lovers, and received a prison sentence of 3 years and 9 months. By this point, investigators looking at Dina's past saw something that people around Julian in 1994 had not been able to see as clearly: a pattern. Money disappeared. Relationships were built on lies. Men were isolated or manipulated. Stories changed when discovery became dangerous, and one former husband had died from a drug overdose under circumstances his own family had never accepted. Detectives reopened their interest in Julian Webb. The original file was no longer just the story of a possible suicide. It was now the story of a dead man whose wife had a proven record of financial deception, and whose later husband had accused her of a frightening attack when her dishonesty was about to be exposed. That did not prove murder, but it justified looking again. Detective Chief Inspector Martin Underhill became deeply involved in the renewed investigation. The problem was obvious. Years had passed. Memories fade. Physical evidence degrades. People move. Documents disappear. A cold case does not become easier simply because detectives now have a stronger suspicion. Then investigators found something useful among Julian's belongings: correspondence connected to a friend in the United States named Don Hudson. Hudson had known Julian through fishing. Police wanted to speak to him because he might remember details from the period around Julian's death. Finding him was not straightforward. British detectives worked with police in Florida, and eventually Hudson came forward after an appeal. At first, he was reportedly unhappy with the way the search for him had made him feel like a suspect. But once detectives spoke to him, he remembered a detail that changed the direction of the investigation. After Julian died, Dina had spoken about what he had eaten: a really hot curry. For years that detail had been sitting there, apparently harmless. Now Underhill looked at it differently. One of the drugs involved in Julian's death, the antidepressant dothapin, had a bitter taste. A powerful, intensely spicy meal could potentially help disguise that bitterness. Suddenly, the curry was no longer just dinner. It was a possible delivery system. That was not enough on its own. A theory about taste would not convict anyone. Detectives still needed science. Julian's burial, the decision Rosemary had insisted on years earlier, meant his remains were still available for examination. In 2001, his body was exhumed from Hailing Island. It was a grim but necessary step. A second postmortem was carried out. Samples were subjected to newer forensic testing, including specialist toxicological analysis. One of the experts involved had experience in major poisoning investigations. The results strengthened the murder theory. Investigators concluded that the level and pattern of drugs in Julian's body were more serious than had originally been understood. The renewed scientific evidence supported the belief that he had not simply taken his own life in the way Dina had claimed. By 2002, police publicly described the case as a murder inquiry. And now, almost 8 years after Julian's death, the question changed. It was no longer, did Julian kill himself? It became, who made sure those drugs entered his body? For detectives, Dina was the central suspect. She had been with Julian. She had prepared or provided his food and drink. She had described the hot curry. She had a financial motive. Her bigamy gave her another reason to fear exposure. She had told others Julian had taken his own life. And the broader history of fraud gave investigators a context in which his death looked very different. Dina was eventually charged with Julian Webb's murder. Her trial at the Old Bailey began in 2003, 9 years after the night Julian died. Trials that revisit old deaths are difficult because juries are asked to step backward through time. They must ignore the dramatic label attached to the accused and focus on what can actually be proved. The press had already begun calling Dina Thompson the Black Widow. But the jury could not convict her because the nickname sounded sinister. Prosecutors had to show that Julian was deliberately poisoned and that Dina was responsible. Their case was built from pieces that had once seemed disconnected. There was the meal. Julian loved extremely hot curry. Prosecutors said Dina concealed bitter antidepressants in that food. There were also drinks containing ground aspirin. There was the toxicology. There was the fact that Julian had become ill at home while Dina was present. There was Rosemary's birthday call and her request that medical help be sought. There were the financial questions after Julian's death. There was Dina's existing marriage to Lee Wyatt. And there was the prosecution's argument that the collision between Dina's two lives was becoming increasingly dangerous for her. The jury also heard about the remarkable web surrounding Lee. Lee described years of manipulation and stories that had pushed him out of ordinary family life. Prosecutors argued that Dina had created elaborate deceptions to keep control and prevent the truth from surfacing. The defense challenged parts of his account and portrayed him as unreliable. That was one of the complications of the case. Some of the stories surrounding Dina were so extraordinary that they could sound fictional even when they were being discussed in a real courtroom. Dina denied murder. Her explanation remained that Julian had taken the drugs himself. In other words, she asked the jury to accept the conclusion that investigators and Julian's family had questioned from the beginning: suicide. But the prosecution now had something the original investigation did not have. It had the benefit of time. Not because time itself creates evidence, but because Dina's later behavior had prompted police to reopen the file. Modern testing had allowed the drugs to be reassessed, and witnesses had supplied details that made the food and medication fit together. The jury deliberated for more than 10 hours. Then, on December 15, 2003, they returned a verdict by a majority of 10-1. Guilty. Dina Thompson was convicted of murdering Julian Webb. She showed little visible reaction as the verdict was delivered. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment and described what she had done in severe terms, calling the killing ruthless and without pity. Police were equally blunt. Detective Chief Inspector Martin Underhill described her as an extraordinarily dangerous woman who had targeted men sexually, financially, and physically. For Rosemary Webb, the verdict did something the open inquest of 1994 never could. It officially gave her son's death a name: murder. But even after the conviction, parts of the story continued to develop. The life sentence initially came with a minimum term that was later reconsidered under changes to sentencing arrangements. In 2007, a high court ruling set the minimum term at 16 years. That did not mean automatic release after 16 years. It meant that once the minimum period was served, the parole board could decide whether she could safely be released. Meanwhile, the Black Widow label followed Dina through prison and into documentaries and newspaper coverage. Stories about other former partners were re-examined. Police looked again at parts of her past, including the unresolved disappearance of a former boyfriend from years earlier. No second murder conviction followed. That distinction matters. Suspicion is not the same as proof, and Julian Webb remains the murder for which Dina Thompson was convicted. Her third husband, Richard, never changed his view of what happened to him. Although Dina had been acquitted of trying to murder him, he continued to believe he had survived an attempt on his life. In later interviews, he spoke openly about his fear of her release. His experience also remained important historically, because without the investigation surrounding him, detectives might never have looked so closely again at Julian's death. That is one of the strangest turns in this case. Dina was acquitted of attempted murder in 2000. Yet the investigation around that allegation helped expose a murder from 1994. One case legally failed to prove that she intended to kill Richard, but it opened the door to evidence that proved she had killed Julian. By the time the parole board considered Dina's release years later, the assessment was not based only on the terrifying headlines attached to her name. The board reviewed her behavior in custody, rehabilitation work, professional assessments, and plans for supervision. In May 2022, it approved her release on license once suitable accommodation was available. She was released that summer after serving roughly 19 years following the murder conviction. The conditions reported around her release were unusually relevant to the way she had offended. They included controls over her movements and contacts, a requirement to disclose new relationships, financial information when required, a curfew, and electronic monitoring. The purpose was obvious. Dina's crimes had not happened in random public encounters. They had developed through intimate relationships, trust, and money. For the surviving men and for Julian's family, release could not erase the history. Julian Webb had been 31 years old. He did not live to see the investigation that eventually proved what happened to him. He did not see his grave opened so that forensic scientists could test his remains again. He did not hear Don Hudson describe the detail about the curry. He did not watch a jury reject the suicide story. His mother did. And her decision not to allow cremation had quietly preserved the possibility of justice. On that birthday night, Rosemary Webb had only one simple instinct. Her son was sick and someone should get help. Years later, a courtroom would determine that what was happening inside that house was far darker than illness. Julian had not simply collapsed after an ordinary birthday meal. According to the verdict that finally closed the central question, the danger had been sitting at the table with him. And the person he trusted most had already decided how the night would end. If this case kept you watching, subscribe for true crime stories with the evidence, timeline, and details behind headlines. Your subscription helps us bring you more cases like this.